Okay, everyone, so we're getting close to our goal here, which is that we have gone ahead and we have figured out how to read in our file. We've developed our regular expression test. We've gone through our we've gone through our file row by row, and we've found that in each row we can look for just the sixth item, which, because we start at 0, is the seventh column, which is what contains our grade value, and we've tested out that our regular expression correctly matches this. So we're, I think, a pretty good chunk of the way there, maybe 75 or 80%. We do see this one problem right in the beginning of our data set, right? Which is that we're testing grade to see if it contains the word fancy, which of course is not really what we need to do. Grade is not really a data point, it's actually our header row. And so we figured out that our header row is actually row number 0. So what we want to do is we want to make kind of an exception here. And we want to say, look, we've got our row values, and I'm going to go through every single value in this, every single value in each row. And we know what we want to have happen if the item number is 6, but we do want to make a special exception for that first row. So what we want to do is we want to say, if the row num is 0, aka our header row, and, nice that we use English here, and our item number is 6, right? That's going to give us our, that's going to be our grade text. Then what do we want to do? If we have a new column, if we have an additional column, we're going to need an additional header, right? And so we're going to go through this and we're going to say, okay, well, if row num is 0 and item number is 0, then I want to go ahead and add, I'm going to print value, right, which is grade. And then I'm also going to print, my next column header, which is going to be, let's say, is fancy, right? Is fancy grade. Let's call it that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and print that. And now I've got that, but here's the question. What happens if row number equals 1 and item number equals 6? Now, it's possible that I could leave it like this. I don't think it would necessarily give me a problem. But what I want to say is basically, if row number is 0 and item number is 6, then I want you to do this special header thing. Otherwise, okay, and I'm going to put in something called elif. And again, like I said, programmers always love shortening things. So I'm actually going to be, that's actually shorthand for else if. In other words, if the row number is 0 and the item number is 6, then I want you to print the value and this new header called that I decided to label is fancy grade. Otherwise, if item number equals 6, aka item number is 6 but row number is something other than 0, then I want you to do this other test, right? So otherwise if, else if, elif, right? A little bit of a cascade of meanings there, but hopefully it'll sort of start to make sense. Otherwise, if item number is 6, then I want you to do this stuff. Now, what if I'm not looking at the grade column? Then what do I need to do? Well, if I go back to my original task, I want to output a new file with that column. I don't know, it's not really clear from there. Oh, right. And false otherwise, reading assistant add a column after the grade column that contains truth and false otherwise. Output a new file. I really want to keep with the new column and all original data, right? So really what I want to do is, if it's not one of these special cases where I need to add something or I need to evaluate something, I just want to say, you know what, otherwise, just give me the value. That's it, that's all, there is no more. So if I take a look at this, I'm going to give this a run, see what I get. And it doesn't look like I've got errors in here. Let's see how we did on our fancy grade. Okay, so this is interesting. So what I see is that I'm getting this sort of carriage return, but I do have this new is fancy grade column. And it looks like our extra things are in there. So what we can see is when we do this print thing, right, what I've actually lost are the commas, right? Remember up here I split on my commas. Well, now I'm in a list. The columns are conceptually there, but there aren't actually there actually aren't commas there anymore. So I'm going to need to go back and add all these things in, right? I need them to have commas between them because, of course, what I ultimately want to output is another comma-separated file. So I'm going to go ahead and put commas around my stuff here, and I'm probably going to need to put a comma here as well. And let's see how we do there. So I've gone ahead and I've gotten all my values. Okay, this looks all right. So let's see what we get. Oh, I've got a lot of empty columns there, but I guess we knew that from our original data file. Right, commodity name, city, okay, yeah, start date, commodity names. All right, this looks okay. This looks all right. So now the next thing that I want to do, though, the thing that I'm missing, right, is I'm not actually creating a new file, right? I need to output a new file. So here's something that, I don't know, might seem kind of counterintuitive, but I think it sort of makes sense, right? Is that when I want to create a new file, I'm actually going to say output file. And what am I going to do? I'm actually going to say open. So in this case, I'm saying to the computer, I want you to set aside some space. I want you to open up some space for a new file. I'm going to tell you what it's called. I'm going to call it Apples Revised, and I'm actually going to put that CSV extension on it too. Why? Because the format of it is going to be, I bothered to put all those commas back in there because I want to be able to open this with a spreadsheet program when I'm done. I may have further work that I want to do on it that isn't related to this particular regular expression. And the other thing, I'm also going to give it a second argument. In this case, I'm going to give it a W. What does the W stand for? Well, if you think back to the Rushkoff reading, he talks about how when he started working with computers, there were these two different types of files, readable and writable. We are creating an output file, and so we want to write things to it. And so the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to take all of my print statements here, and I'm going to say output file write. Okay? So basically what I'm going to say is instead of printing it to this console here, which is a useful thing, a handy thing to have, I don't have to constantly be opening this file. It's kind of giving me a running commentary, if you will, on what my program is doing. Okay, output file write. Whoops, wrong one. So the other thing that I'm just going to draw your attention to as we're doing this, right, is that you may have noticed that when I do something like a for, or I do something like an else or an if, that I always get this indent. Now Python really wants my code to be pretty. You can think of it the way you had to put indents in new paragraphs when you were in middle school. I don't know if that's really done anymore. But what it does is it's a way of, first of all, making it more readable for you. Second of all, it's actually really essential to the way that Python understands what your code is trying to do. In some languages, they do this with curly braces, and so that's how they say, by the way, apply this logic to this other stuff. In Python, it's with indenting, and so what you want to look for is things that are aligned, right? Sort of apply to are things that can be considered together. So if this stuff, then do the stuff that's indented underneath it. Otherwise, if this, then do this other stuff. Otherwise, and that applies to the original one, then do this other stuff. So we've done this stuff. Now what's the final step? Of course, once we've started this output file, we also have to tell the program when to close it, right? We've opened it up, we've written. Now we're done. Close that sucker up, and we're going to move on to the next thing. So again, if everything works as planned, what I can expect is that I will actually create a brand new file with all of my information in it once I have executed this script. So I'm going to hit my debug guy, and ta-da! Apples Revised.csv. So pretty promising start there. Let's see what we can get going here. I'm going to go ahead and open up that folder and see what happens when I open this thing. Now there does seem to be one thing that's happened here that's a little weird, right? Everything seems to be offset by kind of like one column, right? I can see how I've got commodity name, and that's all right. But somehow apples is shifted over one, and I'm not really entirely sure what happened there. So I'm going to take a look back through my code, see if I can't sort out what that is, and I will get back to you guys and let you know how that came together. Okay, folks, so I've done some poking around, and I think I figured out what the problem is. So if we look sort of closely at what we're doing here, We've done a lot of good checking for special cases, right? We've done a check for our special case where our row number equals 0, aka we're in our header row. So we're going to write a special value for our new header rather than writing, rather than evaluating it for whether it has fancy or not in it. There's one sort of end case, or specifically an end case that we've missed here though. And the end case that we've missed is what happens when we come to the end of the file. Now what we're doing here is for everything that doesn't match one of our special cases, we're saying, okay, give me the value and then give me a comma, right? And what's happening is that we're getting that for every single value, including the very last value in our data row. Now, if we think back to how we write a list in English, right? We've been through this before. So if I'm writing an English list, right, I'm going to say equals orange, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, right? But I don't put a comma after the last item in my list. I wouldn't write it in English like this. In our case, instead of putting a period, we put a new line, right? But we want to make sure that we don't end up with this extra comma. So how are we going to get around this problem? It seems pretty easy to simply say, look, if it's not this special case, then just, add the value and then the column, and then the comma afterwards. So of course, what we need to do is we need to do a test and figure out what the last data value is in our actual appropriate data, and then we're going to create another test for that. So we've created a test for the 7th column. We're going to create another test where we look for the last column of data, and in that case, instead of appending a column, we're just going to put the value at the end. So the first way that I'm just going to add some code here to give me a handle on what that last number might be. So I'm just going to say if row num equals 0, then print item num, right? I did this before. I could have looked for it earlier if I'd known this was going to be a problem. I didn't. So I'm going to run this, and there we go. So we see that it's going to be item number 22 is going to be the last item that we want to look for. And so in this case, I still have my sort of default case is wanting to have, look, if it's not a special case, i.e. the 7th column, or now we discover the 22nd position, then I still want to do value plus comma. But if item num equals 22, then I want to say, hey, listen, only write the value and don't put a comma on the end, because if I put that comma on the end, whoops, right? If I put that comma on the end, then I'm going to end up with this sort of everything is shifted over one after the first value. So one more time, I'm going to give this a run, see what happens. I left my print statement in there. That's okay. It's not going to interfere with anything. Although where is that output statement? Oh yeah, I put it at the top here, right? So you see sometimes I add things in and then I delete them later, right? This is all to make sure that it's working the way that I want it to work, right? I mean, that's our end goal in this case. So, I mean, in every case, I think. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to pop open this file, and this looks much better to me. So again, I can imagine that some of you are thinking, hey, why did we take all the time to do this in Python? We already knew how to do it in Google Refine. There will be one more video in this series, probably posted tomorrow, and I'm going to show you how we would use this to evaluate whether or not something came from the United States. Now, the caveat on all of this is that there are a couple of things that we've taken for granted during this module so far, and one of them is the idea that our data comes in a format that's relatively easy to parse, in this case, basically an Excel format. Very often that isn't the case, and that's where this kind of programming is going to be really important. So consider this an exercise for getting used to doing the logic of Python. We wanted to use it with a familiar case and show how something like regular expressions can be used in more than one language or program. But also that very often there's a lot of really dirty data that we have to deal with. And so just consider this a sort of stepping stone towards getting to those more interesting cases, which are frankly going to probably occupy most of your time when you're doing this kind of work. So wanted to kind of back into it a little bit, but hopefully this will give you guys a good place to start.